Hello, folks. Welcome back to Inside the Marble Palace. Post Media's look at the Saskatchewan legislature and all that's going on. We've been away for the summer, but we're back because the session is back and because there's lots going on. Joining me, as always, Jeremy Symes, Leader Post Star Phoenix political reporter and provincial affairs reporter for CBC. Familiar face, Adam Hunter, is joining us. Thank you so much, both you guys. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's good to be back.
Since we got a lot to get into, let's get right into the most exciting stuff possible, which is the Constitution. This should be a fun podcast because we're probably going to talk about Colin Thatcher and we're going to talk about dinosaurs that are not me, or even older than me. Because they came up in the legislature too. But let's get going with perhaps the less exciting, but maybe more important to us in the long run, issue related to the Saskatchewan First Act, and that was presented, I guess, Tuesday in the legislature received first reading. Jeremy, I'm going to start with you. So, in rough terms, can you describe what the act is intended to do and why the constitutional experts that you talked to this week said it might not be able to accomplish that, although it might be able to accomplish something? So, let's begin with what the act looks like.
Sure. So I like to look at the act as if it's in three parts. So part one is basically a declaration of sorts. It's the province saying we have jurisdiction over our natural resources. We have jurisdiction over the emissions from these natural resources. And we also have jurisdiction over fertilizer use and that sort of thing. So just a declaration of what Saskatchewan feels it has a right to already. Constitutional talk is we already have jurisdiction over resources as is spelled out in the Constitution. I just think this reinforces that fact. Part two, a little more interesting for me, is they want to unilaterally amend the Constitution, and that includes amending the Canadian Constitution that we have. And so the province is arguing that Quebec has already done this to amend the Constitution, saying, they're a nation within itself. Saskatchewan's amendment would be a little bit different. So, say they do manage to do this, they would say Saskatchewan has autonomy over its natural resources. And it just goes on to say how important the resources are for our economy, for the people here, and for our viability in the future. Part three is the impact assessment tribunal that they want to create. So, what this would do is it'd be an independent panel that they create. People would come in, they would look at a certain piece of environmental legislation, calculate the costs of that, and then share that cost publicly. Now, what I think is interesting about that, and even this act in itself, is this is where it might become useful, is the province wants to use it as a legal tool potentially, should they ever face a court injunction or a reference case. So what they're saying is if Ottawa comes at them with something, or if they have to go to court for something, they could use this in a way as ammunition, saying we take this seriously and here's why and here's the proof. So those are three parts of the act. Now, the second part of your question is whether this will do anything, will it work? Constitutional experts I spoke with said, on the base of it, especially when it comes to expanding the province's jurisdiction, it's not going to do that. It just reasserts what we already have. And the minister did acknowledge that. But where it does get interesting is if they do get to amend the federal constitution, which there's still debate if that actually ever happened with Quebec, by the way, and whether or not the legal tools that they could get from this, whether they will work. We have to see if that will actually play out in the future. But on a political angle, it'll be interesting to see what the Trudeau government does with this. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said previously that Quebec can unilaterally amend the Constitution. And so Bronwyn Ayre's argument is like, well, if Quebec can do that, why can't we? Why can't we get a fair deal, a fair shake out of this thing? So yeah, those that's what I've heard so far, and we'll just see how it plays out going forward.
The question I keep getting at him, and maybe you can answer it better than I have, is the question of how much of this is actual political posturing related to ongoing battles between the Saskatchewan Party government, Premier Scott Moe, and Ottawa, and how much of this is effective reality. Can you speak to, I guess, the latter part first? As Jeremy said, it's kind of questionable whether we really need to do this, given the fact that we already have the powers. But Bronwyn Ayre is making the argument that as Jeremy suggested, it kind of enhances our abilities in the event that we do go to court. Is that, from what you've gathered and talked to, because you've been talking to experts, to a viable argument or a viable justification for doing that, according to the people that you've talked to? And what have you heard this week that you would kind of put in the category you'd sit back as a longtime political reporter and says, well, I think that they're using this to also score a few political points here and there along the way?
I think it's a natural progression from what we've seen over the last few years under the Mo government, which is, and probably started before that, honestly, which was, we're going to stand up, this is taking from their own language, stand up for Saskatchewan. We need to grow the province. We need to have our economy stay, viable in the future. We're obviously an economy that relies on agricultural, mineral development, and extraction. In using fossil fuels. So it's a cold province. We need to heat our homes and run electricity. And there's been a debate ongoing on whether the government's doing enough to transition to, wind and solar and other sort of renewable resource, if you want to call them that. Bronwyn Ayre said the day that this was announced that, the 2035 clean electricity standard, we hope that it doesn't get to that. Admitting that the government is kind of putting its eggs in a basket of maybe the federal government gets defeated and there's a change of direction, or they can make some of these arguments that they're laying out here in this act. And when it does come to a court case, that they, aren't going to be breaking the laws. Mitch McAdam, the constitutional director for the constitutional law branch for the government, said, this isn't about breaking the law. We're not going to disregard the law. This is about, if we have to go to a court battle, we'll have some of these tools in place. This is kind of setting that out. So, the question you could have is maybe they should have done this previously to the carbon tax fight. Maybe this should have been their first step in going down this road. And I think it was always headed here. And now there's been a lot of constitutional talk, obviously, in Canada this week. It's in the last few months with Alberta's Sovereignty Act pitch from Danielle Smith, with what's happening in Ontario. So I think this is something that was kind of a natural progression. It wasn't as much of the, I think, fire and brimstone that we've heard from the government in the past. Like Bronwyn Ayre was very matter of fact. She was almost, she was admitting to a lot of the things that we've heard from the government, but also I think putting it out there plainly that, this province, as I mentioned, is in a unique position in Canada, unlike other provinces. She said, we don't have the hydro to power ourselves in the future. And so we're trying hard to get there, but we're not going to get there. And so if there's a situation where we need to intervene or need to do something with the federal government when it comes to a court case, we need to, set the rules, and this is what we're going to put out. And you could argue whether this is what Nicole Sarr, the opposition critic, said, this is a copy and paste of what already exists, or whether this is something the government asserts is they need to do this. They need to, set the rules of the game out and let the courts decide what sort of the future is for the provinces, extraction of resources and use of electricity and control over emissions. So I think that's all on the table now. They put it out in the act in plain language, I think, and there's going to be a debate on whether they need to amend the Constitution or not. But I think the larger point is what the message is trying to send. It's sort of less combative than it has been, I think. But it's still something that we should be expecting with the white paper, with the autonomy tour, with the way the premier's talked in the past. This is no surprise.
Jeremy, you've been on a few Alberta podcasts talking to Alberta journalists about this, and I was on one yesterday. And what I'm finding is they're quite fascinated, and the people of Alberta are quite fascinated with the difference between what's being proposed in Saskatchewan right now and what's being proposed by Danielle Smith in Alberta under her Alberta Sovereignty Act. Can you just briefly outline, and I think Adam touched on it a bit, the biggest difference between the two? And as Adam said, why maybe there's been less fire and brimstone in Saskatchewan than there has in Alberta. What is the either constitutional experts or what is it that you're observing right now that would suggest that this is significantly different than the direction that Smith is going?
Well, just to start off, I'm going to use a line from Premier Scott Moe. We haven't seen Premier Smith's legislation, so we don't know what it's going to say. She did say previously that it could reject federal law, they did walk back that, and they said it will respect the Constitution. So now that makes me question whether it actually might look a lot like Saskatchewan's. And I was explaining to someone how in Alberta, how this might be the first time where Alberta could follow something that Saskatchewan does. Usually we like to make the joke that Saskatchewan likes to follow what Alberta does all the time. So I'm really interested to see what Danielle Smith does with her Sovereignty Act and if the language will be the same. When we were in the news conference with Bronwyn Air, we asked how much did the Sovereignty Act weigh in on the Saskatchewan First Act? And she said, you know what? This is ours and ours alone. We've been working on this for a long time, and this is what we have to show for it. And you do have to believe her at that because, like Adam said, this autonomy talk has been happening for a long time. You could say it even went back to Scott Moe's election win, where he said, you know, just watch me when asked how far he'll go with the federal government. So since then, it's kind of set that tone, right? But the rhetoric has dialed down a lot, I would say. Minister Bronwyn was talking about, you know, having an honorable relationship with the federal government. And so I think that really signals that they want to be taken seriously. Now, Danielle Smith, the premier there, has had some issues with that, I think, with some of her language, having to walk back a lot of things. It was interesting because she tweeted yesterday, or was it Tuesday, a picture of her and Premier Scott Moe together being like, we're fighting against Ottawa together, right? So she's using
It was
this.
hard not to notice, wasn't it?
It was hard not to notice. So she's using it as a bit of leverage. I don't think the premier retweeted that tweet though. So we can read it. We can read into that all we'd like, but I am curious to see what Danielle Smith does with her legislation.
I am too. Adam, you've been on a few national shows, and there is an interesting interpretation. Are people across the country making a bit of a distinction between what Alberta and Saskatchewan are proposing? Because I think that's kind of crucial in terms of the credibility aspect. Or might, as Jeremy suggested, we see Danielle Smith's Alberta Sovereignty Act modified to more reflect what's going on here. I think when Danielle Smith proposed it, she's obviously flying without a net and didn't have a constitutional law branch like Bronwyn Air and Scott Moe had in terms of developing their program. But two things: how are people across the country interpreting what's going on in the two prairie provinces? Do they see a difference between what Danielle Smith is proposing and what Scott Moe is proposing? And secondly, might it be a situation where whatever Danielle Smith does eventually propose seems more in line with what Scott Moe is now proposing? And once again, she's playing Chester to our Spike in the old Bugs Bunny cartoon, right?
I think that other events recently have overshadowed this, and we'll get to that. I'm sure, probably much to the province's dismay, that this was going to be their first legislation that they introduced and their big splash of the sitting. This is like kind of the masthead, and it got put on the back pages. So I don't think it's quite getting picked up the way that they would have hoped. I think Danielle Smith has an issue that Scott Moe doesn't have, is that he doesn't have to worry about an election. She does. She ran on the Sovereignty Act to try and win over supporters from her party, and Scott Moe's has to, in a way, appeal to more of a wide base. Danielle Smith now has an election coming up where she's going to have to maybe dial back the Sovereignty Act, judged based by the polls that have come out recently. It's not going to be. She's not as popular with the provincial voters as she is with her own party voters, let's say. So I think that's another thing that's at play here. And as Jeremy mentioned, there is no Sovereignty Act. We haven't seen it. We don't know what's going to be in there. So it's hard to say that. But Saskatchewan, as you know, like we get lumped in together with Alberta, where the prairie province is. We're kind of out there on our own sometimes, and given our commodities and how we make our money, we are lumped together as well in that way. So I think when you're looking out east or wherever, what have you, Saskatchewan and Alberta are going to get lumped together. Whether people can differentiate between the Sovereignty Act or the Saskatchewan First Act, when we see whatever Danielle Smith comes up with, I think that'll be dissected later. But I think that the thing that's important to point out here is that Bronwyn Air, time and again, when asked, said that we're not looking for a fight. We're not planning on going to court over this. This isn't pretense for a legal challenge. So that's a bit different than what we've heard in the past, which is like, we're taking this to court, we're challenging this. Now, there's going to be other legislation that they want to take to the Supreme Court and get Court of Appeal to rule on in the future. But I think that's something that's a bit different than what we've heard in the past.
Well, as much as we all love to wax on about the Constitution as reporters, let's get to that other fun stuff that we were talking about, which was almost a derailed throw-in speech and throw-in speech agenda before it happened, with the invitation of Colin Thatcher by his MLA, Lyle Stewart. Lyle Stewart, I think, formerly worked in Colin Thatcher's constituency in another lifetime, and they've been close personal friends. Adam, I'm going to start with you, and let's play a little bit of inside baseball, because I think you were the first to notice that Colin Thatcher was in the gallery, and thank you for doing so. And I think everybody thanks you for doing so, because it created quite an interesting story. What was your reaction when you first saw him in the legislature?
To give people a background, we sit up top in the House for question period and for things like the throne speech budget day, and we can't take pictures from up there of anyone but the speaker, so the person speaking. So we couldn't take a picture of Colin Thatcher sitting in there, but I was sitting beside Jeremy, and I'm looking around, scanning the crowd, and I'm like, well, there's an empty seat, and I see a man in a brown blazer and a bolo tie, and that looks like Colin Thatcher. And I don't want to date myself. I'm much younger than you, Murray, much younger, and older than Jeremy. People can make their own guesses, but I do know who Colin Thatcher is. When I was starting off as a journalist, he was recently, released on day parole, I believe, and we'd interviewed him when his book came out. So I definitely was familiar with him, obviously. And I think I was kind of dumbstruck, to be honest. And I don't think it quite hit me in that moment that it would turn into such a firestorm. And I don't think any of us did. I asked you to come in and look down and make sure that my eyes were deceiving me. And then, the government, to give people background, when these things are over and when question period is over, we go speak with the government, we speak with the opposition, we make requests for who we want to speak to. And throne speech day is different because it's, there's hundreds of guests in the gallery and people that come out from all sorts of different stakeholder groups and politicians, First Nations chiefs, police chiefs. There's judges there as well. And so we were trying to decide who we're going to talk to, who made news from the throne speech, let's say. And, good on Jeremy and Mickey Jurek, our colleague from the Canadian Press, who waited outside the doors for Colin Thatcher, and he came out and then posed some questions to him. And Mickey eventually carried on and chatted with Colin Thatcher and Lyle Stewart at the reception. So he wasn't, rushed out the side door. He was hanging around like everyone else who was invited. And the government had time to plan a response. If they had no idea that he was coming, then they definitely had 30 minutes, 40 minutes from when he sat down to come up to reporters and come up with a plan of attack, let's say. And Christine Tell was the one that came and talked to us, and she's since had to sort of apologize for what she said. We've heard an unequivocal apology from Scott Moe, who last week said he didn't think he had to apologize. And things have changed very fast. And Christine Tell said to us in the scrum, well, things happen fast. And
yeah, they do. And let's talk about that, how fast it was happening, Jeremy, because as Adam pointed out, you're one of the first reporters to stake out the rotunda and see him come, Colin Thatcher and Lyle Stewart come out. Review how that interview went.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went down to the rotunda. Obviously, the comm staff were like, who do you want? And I kind of just mentioned offhand, I was like, I only care about Colin Thatcher right now. So me and Mickey, we go up kind of to the front of the doors and we're just like anxiously waiting for them to open. And so they open, people are flooding out, ministers and their spouses and whatever. And I'm just like laser focused, right? We're trying to get him. So we get him, and Mickey and I are standing around him, and, we ask, who invited you? He said, oh, I'm not going to say. And then he went on to say, oh, it was my MLA. And then I was like, well, was it Lyle Stewart? And he's like, yes, it was Lyle Stewart. And so I've mentioned this before, but I had to thank Murray for planting that seed in my head to ask that, because I don't know what would have happened if there was no background knowledge there at all. Don't have a lot of knowledge about Colin Thatcher. So we got the confirm. And then I asked, has this been a while since you've been here? He didn't like the question. He's like, well, that's it. I'm done talking. He's walking away. Mickey's kind of shouting some questions like, do you support tough on crime measures? He said, that's enough, and kind of chuckled. And that was that. And then immediately we got Christine Tell, the Minister of Public Safety, out. We asked her questions, and the big question was, just what do you think that he was here? Like a basic open-ended question that a minister can go anywhere with. And she decided to go, well, it doesn't matter. She used his name Colin and said, he has every right to be here like anyone else. He's a free citizen. And it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because even though she says was a free citizen, he's still on parole, right? So he's still part of the justice system technically. And it really does matter that he was there. I think everyone acknowledged that there was a gravity towards what had happened. So that's how it shook out. And it took a few days before we got the unequivocal apology and got Christine Tell out again. And yeah.
Adam, I'm fascinated by this because although you haven't been around as long as I am, you're really old too, and you've been here for a long time. So let's make that clear to the public out there.
Got some greys coming in here. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Caroline would suggest the same. Yeah.
And thanks for joining us on the show. But in your time, in all seriousness, I don't know if I've seen, or at least in recent memory, seen a more messed up communication strategy than I did on this one. And it started with Christine Tell's answer, as Jeremy alluded to. And I guess I'd like if you could possibly provide some insight into maybe why the government's ministers, both Tell and Premier Scott Moe, responded on that Wednesday and Thursday a week ago the way they did. Because for Christine Tell not to understand the ramifications of him being here or suggesting that he was a free man, I think, as she said, and has every right to be here. Well, he's not right; it's a privilege, first of all, because you're invited. And then for Premier Scott Moe the next day say, "Well, I wouldn't have invited him, but I can't understand why everybody's so upset over the invite," and then having to, as you suggested, apologize by the Monday simply because of the political heat that happened. What do you think went wrong in the government's absorption of the magnitude of this issue and the way they rolled it out? Because it honestly did not make any sense to me in terms of how they were handling this.
I think it'll be studied in like comm strategy or response to a situation like this. I don't want to speculate on what was going through their head. I think we can judge them based on what their response was, which was to double down on his invite initially and to defend Lyle Stewart's ability to invite who he wanted to. And as Jeremy said, the minister and you said misrepresenting the justice, the correction system with arguably the most notorious murderer in Saskatchewan history, who was a former MLA who hadn't been seating in the assembly for 40 plus years before he was convicted, before he was charged. He'd obviously been in the building. He was invited in 2006 to be a part of a thing honoring his late father, a former premier. So he had been there, but that was a point where he was still, I believe, on a day parole situation. He wasn't fully, released, let's say, from that. I think that I wrote about this last weekend. The message changed dramatically in 5 days. And you can point to the reaction. The government got hammered. They got hammered by people online. They got it on radio talk shows. They got it from their own supporters, people that are very outspoken supporters of the government who thought this was terrible. And they didn't take the opposition questioning it for it to be one of those things they had to apologize for. Sometimes we see the opposition hammering on an issue, and eventually the government comes out and says, okay, well, it's like a mea culpa or a half apology. We don't hear a ton of apologies from the premier. He's been asked to apologize for things like COVID handling and all sorts of different things. I remember a couple times not disclosing a driving offense, things like that. This was different, and this was something that I think got, as the leader of the opposition said, got international headlines. And the important context here, I think, is that Saskatchewan is dead last in intimate partner violence, domestic violence numbers. They're horrible. It's something that the government has said they're committed to. It's something the opposition has challenged them on. They've talked about not having operational funding for second stage shelters. So there is context here where this isn't just inviting someone who is who killed his wife and was convicted of a life sentence. This is the context of where we live and what the government's message is to women and to people that are victims of intimate partner violence. And that is something that I think put this over the top. This made it much more of a controversy than the doubling down or the defense or Premier Mo saying he's not going to apologize. And I think that people are going to remember this. This is not one of those things that I think gets forgotten and dismissed. It's going to be something that people it sticks in their minds, regardless of who they support. It went over partisan lines.
It certainly did, and from there, it's a tough way to get off the session if you're government, because government has to contend with a lot of saved up issues during the time between sessions. Obviously, there's been inflation, and a lot of the debate in the initial days of the legislature has been around the notion of, who really represents the struggling Saskatchewan people? Is it the Sask party with its $500 check and constitutional challenges that it's saying will preserve oil and potash and agriculture jobs, or is it what the NDP are putting forward when they're saying that people can't afford to pay their electrical bills? There's all been a lot of that already, but very briefly, because we're kind of running a little bit out of time here, because this interesting conversation today. One of the stories that I found really fascinating today was the legacy school uh, students returning to the legislature during Thursday's question period, and Carla Beck absolutely drilling down on Premier Scott Moe to meet with them and the problems that in the past. But what I found most fascinating, Jeremy, was the revealing in the House of the curriculum that had existed and may still exist. We're not 100% sure whether it's being taught at all in at the school as it exists right now, but certainly had been taught in the past. What did the former legacy students say today, this being Thursday, in relation to the curriculum they passed? And I guess we'll get into, Adam, with why this is going to be so controversial. But can you just briefly explain what they said they were being taught in the past and why that might be problematic?
Yeah, absolutely. There was the one instance that stuck out where they were saying this curriculum was saying dinosaurs existed while humans existed, and the Loch Ness monster is an example of that. And we all had a good chuckle about that because that sounded a little outrageous, right? But we were speaking with the students, and there is some seriousness around that because they were saying, we are taught these things and we can't question them, or if we do, we get expelled, and it creates kind of this culture of fear in a way. But it wasn't just the dinosaur example. There was cartoons of little girls being told how they're not supposed to dress a certain way and that sort of thing. So a lot of like misogynist tones. And, this was becoming very normalized in their curriculum. And this is on top of the whole legacy issue, which is talking about, abuse, actual physical abuse that allegedly happened at these schools, emotional abuse and spiritual abuse that allegedly happened as well. So that's like on top of all of that. And so we were told that this curriculum is still being taught today by Caitlin Erickson, who went to school in 2005. We were repeatedly asking the minister, like, is this acceptable? And his answer really was, well, all I know is this happened in 2005. I don't know what it's like today, even though Erickson said it's still being taught today. And he said, well, what we're really concerned about is the outcomes that these schools produce. That's all that our educators are looking for. So it was really hard to get an answer of what he actually thought about what was being taught today. But it just speaks to this greater issue of independent schools, some independent schools teaching certain things, maybe not following the human rights code, and then other allegations that they've.
Absolutely. And Adam, just as we close out, this is one of these stories that we in our journalistic vernacular say has legs, that is going to continue to carry on and haunt the government for a while. What struck you about what Education Minister Dustin Duncan said today that might suggest the story is going to go on for a little bit longer than maybe the government wants to? Because they don't think that because many people don't think it's been addressed properly. What struck you either in terms of either the minister's response or what the students were concerned about that suggests this story will be around for a while?
Well, there's a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. That's the first one, and that's not going away. And the students are outspoken. They're well spoken. They talk to the media regularly. They update the media regularly on what's happening, government response. They've gotten a meeting face to face with the minister. So they're not going away. And I think that is the key thing. So a lot of times here we have one-offs where someone comes in, they talk about an issue that's troubling them, bothering them. They're brought in by the opposition. That can be dealt with in a day, in a week, in a month. We've all seen examples of that. And then it goes away. This one, because it's historical, because the school in some form or another is still operating. And we have 2 schools now out of 3 that were placed under an administrator, which are being scrutinized more heavily. And we're going to get updates on that as well. And I think the thing that stood out to me today was that, Minister Duncan was, as Jeremy said, trying to equate student outcomes with what's being taught there, and also separating qualified independent schools, religious-based schools. They have a right to teach religion. They have a right to teach their, belief system, and that's fine. And I think you pointed out, Murray, that these schools are publicly funded, so we can call them independent, but taxpayers are footing the bill. And it wasn't clear to me that the minister had a grasp on whether these schools are currently teaching problematic, troubling, and just unscientific, easily disprovable things, and whether the students have any ability to challenge that. And I think that is the big one that was unanswered today. And it was kind of said, well, if they're meeting their outcomes, then that's all we care about. We don't know if the extra scrutiny from the ministry is working or will work. And we don't know what's happening in those schools right now. We don't have a good answer of that. We don't know if there's an issue or if the government is really concerned about this as it stands. So there was a chuckle even in the House when the Loch Ness Monster was brought up. I saw people from both sides laughing, but certainly not the message from the students who came out after, who, still talk about their trauma at this school, the things they suffered, the alleged abuses that went on there. And I don't think this is going away. As I mentioned, the lawsuit, the fact that the students are outspoken, they continue to speak, and there's a number of them. There's not just the 3 we talked to today. Others have done media. So I think this is something that's going to stick with the government, stick with the opposition, and we'll have to see where it goes from here.
It is fascinating. I won't comment too much on it because obviously I'm old enough to have covered the dinosaurs. I do know that the Loch Ness is full of eels and not necessarily. I did point that out to the minister today. I hope he now understands that. Anyway, come join us next week on Inside the Marble Palace, where we'll talk more about eels, Loch Ness monsters, and whatever else comes up at the Saskatchewan legislature. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. Adam, it's been a pleasure as usual. Thanks for your insight, guys, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.